Compression can be a little more difficult to get a handle on than some other types of processing, so recording courses and compressor manuals often include suggestions for a number of typical settings that may work on certain types of instruments, vocals, and other audio signals. These are usually meant as starting points to finding the best settings for a particular situation, but many novice users often take them as hard and fast rules for applying compression rather than as suggestions. While these recommendations are usually helpful and do usually offer good advice, they'll typically need to be adapted to specific recordings and mixes rather than taken as gospel, even if that means breaking the so-called rules in the process. Here are a couple of examples. Many how-tos suggest certain ratios for certain types of tracks. A 4:1 ratio is a common suggestion for vocals, with the idea that it'll apply enough gain reduction to have a subtle but useful effect, but not so much as to rob a voice of all its dynamic nuances. For bass, a higher ratio is often called for, something like 10:1 or so, which effectively operates the compressor as a limiter. In both these examples, and in many others as well, the recommendation is to set the threshold so that compression affects only the loudest notes in the track, leaving the rest of the performance alone. This is meant to ensure that compression newbies, whose ears are not yet attuned to the sometimes not so obvious effects of compression, even overcompression, won't over-squash the signal. Hitting just the loudest bits will ensure that most of the more subtle dynamic variations in the rest of the performance are preserved. Now, these are certainly good suggestions, and if they're followed, chances are the result will be well-controlled dynamics without unwanted artifacts. While a 4:1 ratio is definitely a good starting point, the amount of compression needed will ultimately be determined by the actual recorded dynamics of a particular track and how it sits in the mix, what's going on around it level-wise, and how much dynamic reduction sounds appropriate for the musical style and the specific song and arrangement. I've ended up setting the ratio on vocal tracks to everything from 2:1 up to around 6 or even 8:1 with appropriate and effective results without making the part sound wrong or over-processed.
But I know that it's a fallacy. The truth is spoken in your deeds.
When it comes to threshold, using that setting to distinguish louder notes to be compressed from softer ones to be left alone is a logical approach, but again, it's not the only one. An alternative is to set a much lower threshold, a level that'll compress almost everything in the track, louder and softer bits. The idea is to impart gradual changes in level that'll more subtly squeeze the dynamics of the signal without sounding as squashed or without as noticeably affecting the dynamics of the loudest sections. Some compressors excel at this more than others. See video number 8. This approach should be applied carefully to achieve the smoothest dynamics. You'll usually want a lower ratio than you might have chosen if you'd set a higher threshold, as above. From 4:1 maybe down to around 2:1 or so, can end up applying the same amount of dynamic range reduction as higher ratios and higher thresholds, but again, with smoother and more gradual changes in overall dynamics.
But I know that it's a fallacy. The truth is spoken in your deeds.
If the compressor has a control labeled knee, this can also help. The knee determines exactly when gain reduction starts and stops. A basic hard knee means that attenuation abruptly begins as soon as the signal level goes above threshold, and abruptly stops as soon as it drops back below, based precisely on the chosen ratio. A soft knee lets attenuation start slightly before threshold is reached, and doesn't reach full attenuation until the level exceeds threshold a bit further. A hard knee circuit can sometimes cause levels to change too quickly when the signal hovers around the threshold, which can cause a standard compression artifact called pumping. A soft knee design will make these level changes occur less abruptly, more gradually, for a smoother overall compression quality. A soft knee response, combined with a lower threshold and ratio, may provide a much smoother compression characteristic, allowing for much more needed squeeze even while the track sounds less compressed.
But I know that it's a fallacy. The truth is spoken in your deeds.
These are just a couple of examples of approaches that may deviate from the standard text, but are widely used to good effect by engineers who know their way around compression. Starting off with a standard recommendation and then pushing things a bit can also be a good way to train your ears to become more attuned to some of the subtler audible qualities of compression.